Praise be to thee, O Lord my God. I implore thee by thy name, that hath caused to surge within every drop the oceans of thy loving kindness and mercy, and to shine within every atom the luminaries of thy bountiful blessings and favors. I implore thee to adorn every soul with the ornament of thy love, that none may remain on thine earth who hath not turned towards thee, or hath failed to detach himself from all except thyself. Thou hast verily, O my God, suffered him who is the manifestation of thine own self to be afflicted with all manner of adversity, in order that thy servants may ascend unto the pinnacle of thy gracious favor, and attain unto that which thou hast through thy providence and tender mercies ordained for them in the tablets of thine irrevocable decree. The glory of thy might beareth me witness, were they every moment of their lives to offer up themselves as a sacrifice in thy path, they would still have done but little in comparison with the manifold bestowals vouchsafed unto them by thee. Grant, therefore, I beseech thee, that their hearts may be inclined towards thee, and that their faces may be turned in the direction of thy good pleasure. Powerful art thou to do what thou willest. No God is there but thee, the inaccessible, the all-glorious, the ever-forgiving. Deign then to accept, O my God, from thy servant the things which he hath shown forth in his love for thee. Fortify him then, that he may cling to thy most exalted word, and to unloose his tongue to celebrate thy praise, and cause him to be gathered unto such of thy people as are nigh unto thee. Thou art he within whose grasp is the empire of all things. There is no God but thee, the Almighty, the help in peril, the all-glorious, the unconstrained.
A very warm welcome to everyone this evening. This evening program in the series of the Serving the Divine Plan is a presentation on sacrifice. We have the pleasure this evening of asking Mrs. Ramirez to come and join us on stage. If you would please welcome her.
Dearly loved friends, good evening. Despite the topic I'm presenting tonight, which is sacrifice, I wish each and all of you a joyful evening. Tonight, I will attempt to delineate some spiritual truths and insights on the subject of sacrifice, as treated in selected quotes from the writings. In detail, my presentation focuses on the meaning, significance, mystery, and the station of sacrifice, and on joy, pain, and detachment as elements of sacrifice. Toward the end, I will dwell upon the implications of sacrifice on the progress of the divine plan and the fulfillment of the goals of the present 5-year plan. Allow me to anchor my talk on a story recorded in the book of Mr. Adib Taherzadeh, Revelation of Baha'u'llah, Volume 2, where 2 lines from a poem puts forth the conditions for those souls who wish to approach the Blessed Beauty. When Baha'u'llah was in Baghdad, a certain Mirza Muhyiddin Kirmani, a sheikh who had attained the presence of the Baha, and whose attitude towards the faith was that of concealed opposition, sent a message to Baha'u'llah through Prince Kayvan Mirza. He requested a confidential interview with Baha'u'llah late at night, so that no one except the prince would know about it. The reason given for this secrecy was that, should the meeting become public knowledge, the position of Mirza Muhyiddin in the Muslim community would be undermined. Baha'u'llah asked the prince to share with the sheikh 2 lines of an ode which he himself had composed while in Kurdistan, setting forth the conditions for those who wish to partake of his glory. Here are the lines. If thine aim be to cherish thy life, approach not our court. But if sacrifice be thy heart's desire, come, and let others come with thee. For such is the way of faith. If in thy heart thou seekest reunion with Baha, shouldest thou refuse to tread this path, why trouble us? Be gone. Baha'u'llah is reported to have said to the prince, if he be willing, he will openly and unreservedly hasten to meet me. If not, I refuse to see him. When Mirza Muhyiddin heard of this, he did not find the courage to go and meet Baha'u'llah. Our having joined the World Center staff is a clear sign, I feel, of our heart's desire to walk the path of sacrificial service and seek reunion with the ancient beauty. This realization serves as my inspiration to go on with this discourse. It seems to me that it might be worthwhile to introduce the topic of sacrifice using a couple of familiar phrases. The first, sacrificial giving, is normally one of the first things we Baha'is become aware of in connection with our spiritual obligation and privilege to give to the fund. We learn early on that it is our sacred duty to give to the fund regularly and generously, undeterred by the meagerness of our material resources. And that sacrificial giving, in all frankness, means we are to give until it hurts. We understand the guardian's injunction that we must be like the fountain or spring that is continually emptying itself of all that it has and is continually being refilled from an invisible source. We become inspired as we discover that Baha'u'llah himself, in the Persian Hidden Words, writes that to give and to be generous are attributes of mine. Well is it with him that adorneth himself with my virtues. The second phrase, where we are well acquainted with, is sacrificial service. In its welcome message to new staff members, the Universal House of Justice states that the essence of life here at the World Center is sacrificial service. That the spiritual character of such service needs to be ever present in one's mind. That service as a form and a spirit, that the form is to be found in the specific position to which one is assigned, and the spirit is one's motivation in performing one's assigned duties. The House of Justice points out that no matter what task we are given, if it is performed for love of God, then it will be acceptable in His sight. The letter goes on to expound on the circumstances and challenges that we face while we are here, including the fact that we experience tests and grow as we exert efforts to overcome them. The Supreme Body then concludes his letter by stating that the treasure of the time we spend here at the World Center is found in self-sacrificing service to Baha'u'llah and his faith, and the spiritual bounty which such service brings to our souls. These two expressions provide us with an initial glimpse of what sacrifice means. The first implies that sacrifice is giving as much as we have, in fact, all that we have. And the second, the service performed for love of God and the sacrifice that such service entails will earn the good pleasure of our Lord. No wonder then that Abdul Baha himself said that to make a sacrifice is to receive a gift. It is interesting to note that the root word of sacrifice is a combination of two Latin words, sacer meaning sacred and facere meaning to make. That is, to sacrifice is to make sacred. It is heartening to learn as well that from the very beginning, the word itself has the mention of sacredness in it. Unfortunately, while the concept of sacrifice, apparently prevailing in the larger society, includes the act of giving up, surrendering, or offering something, the sacredness of the motivation behind such acts, for example, the love of God for the common good and others, appears to have been forgotten, or at the most regarded only as a secondary matter. Mystery of sacrifice. Abdul Baha often talked about sacrifice during his visit to the West. He would describe the concept of sacrifice with the use of idioms. The meaning of sacrifice, the significance of sacrifice, mystery of sacrifice, and the station of sacrifice. He used them almost interchangeably, as is the case with his presentation. He made use of analogies that were specially suited to the audience he was speaking to. Finding himself in the midst of Christians, he would lovingly explain the meaning of Christ's sacrifice. One of his more intense elucidations of sacrifice took place on 29 November 1912 in New York. In this talk, the master constructed his discussion around the quote from Christ, in which he said, "I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If any man eats of this bread, he shall live forever." He began by discussing the physical sacrifice of Christ, emphasizing that despite his knowing very well what his actions would lead to for himself, Christ still gave his blood and accepted calamity and death for his love in his love for mankind. This, the master said, is one of the meanings of sacrifice. By this initial explanation, Abdul Baha highlighted that love is the fundamental and supreme incentive of sacrifice. Then he went further to unveil a bit more of the mystery by clarifying the Baha'i position on the reality of man. He did this, in essence, by explaining that the reality of Christ was not his body, but his spirit. Therefore, in the context of the quote, "I am the living bread which came down from heaven," it was not the body of Christ that descended from heaven, but his heavenly perfections, his spiritual qualities. The master then concluded that what Christ meant by these words is that the perfections that people were attracted to in him were his spiritual qualities, that the blessings within him were heavenly gifts and bestowals, and that his light was the light of reality. So when Christ said, "If any man eats of this bread, he shall live forever," follows that he who takes on these spiritual qualities and attains unto the reality of the Spirit shall live forever. The Master then said, this is one of the mysteries of sacrifice. This explanation does not seem to follow the world's typical conception of sacrifice, because it regards sacrifice from the point of view of spiritual reality. From this standpoint, it is clear that by turning aside from worldly things and learning how to live in accordance with the divine teachings, we are sacrificing crumbs for the living bread which came down from heaven. When viewed from the seeing eyes and hearing ears of the Master, we can understand lucidly what he meant when he said, to make a sacrifice is to receive a gift. Building on this context, Abdu'l-Baha went on to exemplify further by using two analogies. The first is that of the seed that becomes a sacrifice for the tree. He says that the seed is outwardly lost and destroyed, but the same seed which is sacrificed will be absorbed and embodied in the tree, its blossoms, fruits, and branches. Therefore, like the seed that sacrificed itself for the tree, Christ sacrificed himself for the tree of Christianity, which has brought forth blossoms and fruits that have upgraded civilization. With this analogy, it is easy to see again how sacrifice is not merely an act of giving up something, but in many cases, it is laying the foundation for building up something much greater. Translated into deeds, this analogy can be expressed in the sacrifices we make in our own lives, particularly in our efforts to share the Word of God with others. It is often said that when we teach, we are planting seeds in the soil of human hearts. To do this well, we may make a number of purported sacrifices. Sacrifice our time and energy to increase our knowledge of the teachings, to memorize the holy writings, to participate in study courses, and more importantly, to reach out to seekers and nurture them in their journey towards Baha'u'llah. But the seed of these efforts, once planted in the soil of a receptive heart, has the potential to grow into the tree of recognition of and faith in Baha'u'llah. The Master then went on to a fourth significance of sacrifice. He referred to it as the principle that a reality sacrifices its own characteristics. That is to say, man must sacrifice the qualities and attributes of the world of nature for the qualities and attributes of the world of God. In other words, spiritual transformation. Here, the Master drew attention to the analogy of iron and fire. Iron is solid, black, and cold. But when it is put in the fire, it sacrifices these qualities for those of the fire. In the same way, when we study the revelation of Baha'u'llah and align our lives with the divine teachings, we sacrifice our conditions for the divine station of God. We often read in the writings that man's imperfection arises from his physical nature and his perfection from the spiritual. Hence, sacrifice consists of man's subduing and giving up the qualities and attributes associated with his physical nature, such as self-worship, ferocity, and passion, and acquiring those spiritual attributes like selflessness, generosity, and loving kindness. Howard Colby Ives, one of the early Western believers, had the bounty of attending this talk of the Master. He recorded his impressions in his book, Portals to Freedom. Mr. Ives left this meeting with a renewed hope and desire to attain what he referred to as freedom from the lower, the animal, the selfish, the egoistic self. It was a goal which had become, for him, for that moment, an attainable goal. He ended this section of his book with the following substantiation. Moreover, the very word sacrifice had become alluring. No longer did it connote suffering or deprivation. It was clearly seen as this exchange of something less worthful for something infinitely more worthful. It had become not a giving up of desirables, but the acquisition of desirables. Instead of a doubtful proposition in which the profit was intangible and uncertain, it has assumed the proportions of a clear-cut business proposition. I was in the market for pearls. I had now my eye on the pearl of greatest price. If we feel that we're still a bit unclear about the mystery of sacrifice, we may take comfort in the fact that a person as well versed as Amatul Baha Ruhi Akanum, with her close association with the guardian, as well as her personal sacrifices, wrote that, "I am afraid the mystery of sacrifice still remains a mystery to me." Moreover, in Volume 3 of the Revelation of Baha'u'llah, the author states that although we will not fully understand the mystery of sacrifice in this world, we can find through the writings that there is a tremendous power released when man sacrifices something in the path of God. Nevertheless, it is hoped that the thoughts proffered tonight will encourage us to offer a score of sacrifices or so as we tread various paths of service from one global plan to another in the next 15 years, in order to turn this nether dust into high heaven, to make of this world a mirror for the kingdom. In striving to reach the plane of sacrifice, it is important to remember that we can only do so out of love of God and with the utmost joy. At first glance, for many of us, this may be a difficult concept to accept because sacrifice is painful. And most of us try to avoid pain, especially when we don't clearly see the benefits at the beginning. But in truth, how many of us put ourselves through pain for a cause that we feel is worthy? I know this is clearly understood by some of you who are athletic-minded and health-conscious, or both. Because on my way home from the office every evening, I see some of you with your shoulder bags in Mercaz, going for a workout at the gym. And I must say that we all see the benefits as well, because some of you are really looking very fit, despite the pain. But I guess I should get some relevant data from health services and personnel office to validate this observation. I think many of you would agree that we're able to endure pain when love is the motivating factor, which is evident when we consider the relationship between a parent and a child, the sacrifices we make for our family and friends. If we take our time and effort to pick up a friend from the airport or go through pain to help someone we love, we do it with joy and radiance. If we do it without love, then our attitude becomes spiteful and selfish, and we will probably think of it as a major inconvenience. So we can well understand how our love for God, and specifically our love for Baha'u'llah as the manifestation of God for this day, must be the preponderant force in our lives if we desire to reach the exalted condition of sacrifice. In the context of sacrifice, we can well reflect on what has been previously stated, that there are elements of pain in every sacrificial act, such as the examples given by Baha, the transformation of a seed into a tree, the solid iron into liquid, and our own selfish nature into a selfish channel for the will of God. But at the same time, when we review the history of our faith, we're deeply touched by the valor of those who suffered great pain for the cause, and did so with exceeding gladness. I suppose that for many outside the faith, this would be what one might call a mystery, but this concept is quite clear to us. The holy day we commemorated last week is a classic example. Like Christ before him, when the Bab arose in Persia to put forth his claim of prophethood, he knew very well that this would lead to his eventual execution. And he accepted this fate with exceeding joy. You remember well the request in his prayer that God may grant that the day of attaining his holy presence would be fast approaching. It would take us a significant amount of time to cite all the passages in the holy writings in which the manifestations beg the Almighty to be allowed to suffer tribulations and to be made a sacrifice for the cause of God. One striking example of such spirit of joy in seeking sacrifice is found in one of Baha'u'llah's prayers and meditations, where he proclaims to God that all the limbs and members of my body proclaim their readiness to be torn asunder in thy path, and for the sake of thy pleasure, and they yearn to be scattered in the dust before thee. We do not have to look far to see this element of joy evidenced in the life and writings of Baha. You will recall his remark to an individual who asked him how he felt while he was in prison and when he was released. His reply was, "Freedom is not a matter of place, it is a condition. The lack of liberty was very pleasing to me, for those days were passed in the path of service, under the utmost difficulties and trials, bearing fruits and results. Therefore, I was happy all the time in prison. When one is released from the prison of self, that is indeed release, for that is the greater prison." Once the love for Baha'u'llah is in our hearts, how do we then approach the plane of sacrifice? A virtue closely related to our love for him, and ultimately our capacity for sacrifice, is that of detachment. All of us have a deep love for Baha'u'llah, but our attachment to the things of the world may prevent us from making the necessary sacrifices to approach his court. Baha'u'llah tells us to disencumber ourselves of all attachment to this world and the vanities thereof. And he explains that the term "this world" meant our unawareness of him who is our maker and our absorption in all else but him. To illustrate the connection between detachment and sacrifice, I would like to refer to a letter written by Baha to a community of Baha'is in Isfahan in Iran. In this letter, the Master remarked about the rapid spread of the faith throughout the East and West, and recalled his delight that a house of worship was being raised in the heart of the American continent. While referring to this achievement, he related the story of a highly esteemed lady who was moved to offer her share, saying, "Having no portion of goods and earthly riches, she sheared off with her own hands the fine, long, and precious tresses that adorned her head so gracefully, and offered them for sale. that the price thereof might promote the cause of the masterful Asgard. Of course, with this abundant love for the friends, the master went on to remark this was uncalled for, and that if consulted, he would not have consented to such a deed. Yet he expressed his delight that the highly honored lady had evinced so rare and beautiful a spirit of self-sacrifice. Abdul Baha explained to the Persian friends whom he was addressing that nothing is more precious to Western women than rich and flowing locks. Hence, that spirit of self-sacrifice has touched him. He then equated the story with an anecdote during the days of the Prophet Muhammad, in which the faithful were allowed to offer contributions to advancing the cause of God. One man gave 1,000 camels, another gave half his substance, and still another offered all the land that he had. But a woman stricken in years, whose sole possession was a handful of dates, came to the apostle and laid her humble contribution at his feet. Thereupon the prophet bade that his handful of dates be placed over and above all the contributions that had been gathered, because this woman sacrificed everything. The women in the two stories were able to make these sacrifices because their love for God was much greater than their love for the world, and therefore they were detached from their possessions. One might ask, how do we become detached from worldly things? In the words of wisdom, Baha explains, the essence of detachment is for man to turn his face towards the courts of the Lord, to enter his presence, behold his countenance, and stand as witness before him. So it seems that the more time we spend in communion with God, the more our detachment from the world will grow. Taking the time to read the sacred writings in the morning and in the evening, performing our daily obligatory prayers with pure-hearted devotion, studying and meditating on the Word of God. These are but some of the ways by which we can increase our detachment. Perhaps one of the most accessible means to become detached from this world is to commune with God through service. Because when we are engaged in service, we naturally become forgetful of self, yet ever mindful of what is His. Now I hope that we can take a step back and look at the broader implications of sacrifice on the community and society as a whole. In the document One Common Faith, which was commissioned by the Universal House of Justice during the recent 5-year plan, we find the following observation about the power of religion. As humanity's purpose includes the carrying forward of an ever-advancing civilization, not the least of the extraordinary powers that religion possesses has been its ability to free those who believe from the limitations of time itself, eliciting from them sacrifices on behalf of generations, centuries into the future. Allow me to take this opportunity to explore some concrete examples of how the current sacrificial efforts of individual Baha'is and the Baha'i community as a whole are collectively lending impulse toward progress of the divine plan and toward that civilization that is ever advancing generations into the future. Let us try to imagine for a moment what this earth would be like if a majority of its population were detached from earthly things, were imbued with the spirit of sacrificial service to humanity. This would certainly be an earth that is a lot closer to the kingdom of God, wouldn't it? It would be wonderful if such a change could take place overnight. But as we have already discussed, reaching the plane of sacrifice demands detachment. So how do our sacrifices to serve the divine plan move this process further along and bring us closer to the kingdom of God? Let us consider the work of the 5-year plan, which is focused on educating humankind about the revelation of Baha'u'llah and training individuals to share with more and more people about this revelation and his teachings. There is the specific act of teaching the cause to seekers that we'll talk more about a little later. Even so, detaching ourselves from worldly things can be very strenuous, especially when we begin the process as adults. Right now, permit me to use several minutes to examine how children and junior youth, through 2 of the core activities of the 5-year plan, are being imbued with the spirit of sacrifice from an early age. As an example, I wish to draw your attention to one of the lessons that's presented to children of age 6 and 7, and oftentimes to those of ages 8 to 10. In the old book 5, this is actually for teaching children's classes grade 2. I'm referring to lesson 12, which actually is said to take 3 class sessions. As in any Baha'i class for children, the first few minutes are devoted to reciting prayers, memorizing a prayer, as well as studying and memorizing a quotation. In lesson 12, the teacher puts the following explanation before presenting the quotation. Let me share it with you in full. A seed breaks in the ground, sacrifices itself so that a tree can grow from it. The river ceases to be a river once it reaches the sea. It sacrifices itself to become part of a great ocean. A candle consumes itself so as to become light and illumine its surroundings. Sacrifice is a law of existence. Without it, change is impossible. Growth is impossible. If we wish to grow spiritually, we must be ready to sacrifice that which is worth less in order to receive that which is more worthy. Abdul Baha lived a life of sacrifice. He endured pain and difficulty in the path of service to humanity, and he greatly appreciated the sacrifice others made for the cause. Once, a poor laborer gave a traveler who was on his way to visit Abdul Baha his own meal, an apple and a piece of bread. He asked that this be given to the master as a token of his love. By the time the traveler reached the presence of Abdul Baha, the apple was shriveled and the bread was dry. But the master, rather than eating the meal prepared for him, ate the humble food, saying to the friends around him, "Eat with me of this gift of humble love." The teacher then introduces the following quotation, which has been presented earlier, to remind the children of the significance of sacrifice. The mystery of sacrifice is that man should sacrifice all his conditions for the divine station of God. Before the children memorize the quote, they first look into the words conditions and station, mainly by examining sentences that would make them clearer to the children. For example, 2 sentences are used for this purpose, for the word station. One is, Mr. Chingwe took great satisfaction in his work as a teacher because he was able to help the children increase their knowledge, improve their characters, and acquire useful skills. He helped them reach their true station in life. The other sentence is, Joshua was making a fool of himself. He was acting beneath his station. singing songs and telling stories follow. The book itself is a collection of over 60 songs, some of which are stories in themselves. Historical episodes compose most of the stories in this book. In this particular lesson, the story is about a believer who was among those who were persecuted because they accepted the Baha and his teachings. They were often ridiculed and beaten by those who blindly followed their power-hungry leaders. One such friend was so badly beaten that he could barely drag himself to the outskirts of the town, where he fell asleep due to sheer exhaustion. He dreamt about a great personage who told him that despite the injuries heaped upon you, we extended our protection that you might remain alive. Be not grieved and come to us in Baghdad. To make the long story short, this man ultimately met Baha'u'llah. Can you imagine then the profound joy of this believer when he saw the blessed beauty and recognized him as the holy personage in his dream? His entire being was filled with unspeakable gratitude and happiness. Having been willing to accept death in the path of the cause of God, he had been given a new life and has been led by the hand of providence directly into the presence of the beloved of all hearts. By the way, because of time constraints, I omitted more than half of the text of this story, where more interesting details are described. So if you are interested, you may refer to lesson 12. Performing creative dramas is another part of this lesson. After the children go through some relevant motion exercises, the teacher moves on to activities directly related to the theme of sacrifice. He begins by telling the children that there are many things in this world that have to go through hardship and pain in order to change and become something better. He gives examples of these things: a seed growing into a tree, a caterpillar turning into a butterfly, a stone being shaped and polished into a jewel, and describes the changes each of these things go through and asks the children to act them out in drama form. For instance, the teacher explains that for a stone to become a beautiful jewel, it must be cut and shaped by the careful hands of a jeweler, who uses his hammer and chisel to chip away at the stone until its form is perfect, and then polishes the stone until it shines brightly. The teacher divides the children into pairs. One acts as the stone, the other as a jeweler. The stone stands very still, and the jeweler looks it over. He pretends to pick up his hammer and chisel and begins. While the jewelers work under stones, the teacher moves around from pair to pair, commenting on their progress. He would say, for example, "This stone still has some few rough spots," or "This stone looks like it's ready to be polished." Thereafter, a question and answer session takes place. How did the stone feel when it was being chipped at? If it was not chipped up at and polished, would it have become a beautiful jewel? What is the difference between a stone and a jewel? Which one is more valuable? As in the case of acting out a seed and a caterpillar, you can imagine how lively it is. Followed by similar question-answer periods, we can imagine how certainly creative and insightful the children would be, and how they must have greatly enjoyed the lesson. The last part of lesson 12 is the drawing exercise, where the teacher chooses an image that will strengthen the children's understanding of the concept of sacrifice and have them draw it. Note that several possible images have already been mentioned in the lesson itself. The lesson, of course, draws to a close with an appropriate prayer. These details that describe Lesson 12 are a telling indication how children begin to acquire a deep understanding of the meaning and significance of sacrifice at an early age. The 30 lessons in the book focuses on themes ranging from forgiveness and mercy, joyfulness, patience, selflessness, and prayerfulness, to the principle of justice, the transforming power of Baha'u'llah's message, the sufferings of Baha'u'llah, and the covenant he established with the believers before his passing. What I have described to you refers only to a small portion of our spiritual education program for various age groups of children. In addition to this, classes for the 11-14-year-old junior youth continue to reinforce these themes. For example, the need for detachment is presented in some portions of at least 2 books for junior youth. Walking a straight path and learning about excellence. The following quotes are among those being studied in a similar, participative, and experiential manner as the children do. Happy the soul that shall forget his own good, and like the chosen ones of God, vie with his fellows in service to the good of all. No man shall attain the shores of the ocean of true understanding, except he be detached from all that is in heaven and on earth. Of course, all of us know this also reinforced further in the sequence of courses. As soon as these junior youth enter the sequence of courses as 15-year-olds, these themes are consistently reinforced as well. For example, sacrifice is further dealt with in books 2, 6, and 7, bringing into sharp relief the concept and various aspects of sacrifice. Book 4 specifically focuses on the lives of the twin manifestations, which, as we all know, is replete with sufferings that are characterized with a spirit of joy. This provides us a clear idea of the kind of children, junior youth, and youth who grow up steeped in the spiritual truths and insights embedded in these lessons, and how better prepared and capable the next generation of Baha'is will be for teaching and consolidation work, and in meeting the challenges of growth, as well as in facing the challenges of opposition in the future. This experience of our children, junior youth, and youth, as they move through these lessons, will have an indelible mark on the quality of their service to the faith in their later years, and also a long-term impact on the spiritual transformation of the believers and the Baha'i communities, not to mention the larger society. Considering that a significant number of our students in these classes come from non-Baha'i families, reports we receive attest to the transforming power of the sacred word on the spirit and the manner of the participants in these classes. Dear friends, in its message of 27 December 2005, the Universal House of Justice acknowledged the importance of individual initiatives in the past 5-year plan. In paragraphs 7 and 8, the House of Justice praised the efforts of those believers who serve as teachers in sharing the faith with others, in tutoring study circles, in assisting participants to acquire those capacities and accompanying them as they begin to serve in a similar manner. Stories abound of sacrificial efforts of teachers, tutors, animators, and teaching teams. No doubt, these paths of service, as well as pioneering at international level or on the home front, will continue to be among the critical factors in achieving the goals of the 5-year plan. Allow me to cite a few brief stories received by the International Teaching Center from friends in a number of clusters. These modest accounts appear to initially fulfill the kind of service referred to in this quote from the greatest holy leaf, Baha. When I think over the history of the cause and the many difficulties that all its promoters have undergone, I unhesitatingly am convinced that the sincere friends who have watched the events will not lose a moment, but will, with all their hearts and souls, sacrifice everything of worth in order to realize that for which the divine plan has been working. The first story comes from a cluster in Western Europe, where individual teaching initiatives during the expansion phase of the fourth cycle of its intensive program of growth invariably met with success. As one goes on reading the four stories featured in the cluster's newsletter, one sees that the friends involved had been released from their own selves and, setting aside their initial fears, courageously rushed forward to respond to the spiritual longings of their personal contacts, most of whom have been longtime friends and co-workers. In a cluster in Southeast Asia, there is the story of a 20-year-old lady who spent all her weekends in the last 4 months of rainy season in an area which can be reached by taking a jeep overland for 2 hours, then for a half day by foot through some bushes, a stream which often overflowed, and a river that would get swollen at the slightest rain. She assisted some of the friends there to move through the sequence of institute courses. Even if the group has yet to complete the sequence, she had already assisted 3 participants in co-tutoring the lower books, and another in establishing a children's class. When the participant was asked about the effect of the institute courses, he replied, "She has helped us gain a deep understanding of the writings and the concepts in the courses. This is a treasure no one can steal from us." A report from Northern Europe describes a disabled woman fighting with odds just to ensure that a new Baha'i is able to enter the institute process. The story goes this way. Despite many phone calls and attempts to visit this new believer, one thing or another would always come up, and these obstacles would prevent her from approaching his friend. Finally, summoning all her courage, and unsure of whether the new friend would be at home, this lady set off to invite her to join Book One. To accomplish her mission, this lady fought disability, crutches, lack of transport, and a pack of dogs. Well, perhaps the crutches came in handy after all, before she was able to talk to her friend. Through her encouragement and positive spirit, the new believer agreed to take part in the study circle. Another story from the same part of the world is about a mother who worked very hard to overcome her anxieties, to reach out to the wider society. Having been trained as a tutor, she decided to invite mothers she knew from the school which her children attended. After some initial hesitation, she made some flyers explaining clearly what Book One is all about and distributed them personally. At the first meeting of the study circle, 3 mothers attended. In describing her experience, she said, "I didn't sleep all night. These are our own frailties, but we must not hold back others because of our own nervousness." After a few sessions, her confidence has increased so much that she has started a second study circle with 3 more seekers. Now, where is the sacrifice in this? Did you know that she spent a sleepless night for her study circle, thinking how she would survive, perhaps? Despite her frailties and misgiving, she did, because of others whom she felt should not suffer because of her lack of confidence. had sleepless nights, thinking of our contacts, thinking of our study session the next day or the coming weekend. Well, I just did. Several sleepless nights. But I'm not saying I have sacrificed. As you might have noted, these brief stories bear testimony to what the House of Justice stated in its message of 9 January 2001 about the capacity of the Baha'i world to respond to vast numbers among the peoples of the world who are ready, indeed yearn for the bounties that Baha'u'llah alone can bestow upon them. In learning to systematize their large-scale teaching work, Baha'i communities are becoming better equipped to respond to this longing. They cannot hold whatever effort, whatever sacrifice may be called for. Let me close by sharing a brief assessment of the stations of sacrifice and the form of sacrifice that is needed at this stage in the advancement of the cause. Let us recall part of a message that the beloved guardian wrote to the American believers. The community of the organized promoters of the faith of Baha'u'llah in the American continent, the spiritual descendants of the dawn breakers of an heroic age, who by their death proclaimed the birth of that faith, must in turn usher in, not by their death, but through living sacrifice, the promised world order, the shell ordained to enshrine that priceless jewel, the world civilization, of which the faith itself is the sore begetter. Living sacrifice is what the guardian asks of the American friends to demonstrate with wisdom and grace. And I think they, and probably the guardian as well, won't mind if we now view this council as an all-inclusive framework for all Baha'is the world over. To gain more insight into the high-ranking station of living sacrifice, let's look into a couple of quotations into letters from the guardian that were written in reference to the last of the Arabic hidden words, which compels us to purposefully reflect upon the rarefied stations of sacrifice. Here is the last of the Arabic hidden words. O Son of Man, write all that we have revealed unto thee with the ink of light upon the tablet of thy spirit. Should this not be in thy power, then make thine ink of the essence of thy heart. If this thou canst not do, then write with that crimson ink that hath been shed in my palm. Sweeter indeed is this to me than all else, that his light may endure forever. Referring to this, the guardian articulates, as for the station of sacrifice, the first reality of sacrifice is forsaking all worldly desires and traces of the world of being, and utter nothingness in the will of the Lord of hosts. Baha'u'llah has ranked the shedding of one's blood in his path to be third in position, and that too is conditioned upon the divine pleasure and his irrevocable purpose, and not upon one's choice or desire. When asked in reference to this hidden word, how can one reach the stations that rank higher than the station of martyrdom? The guardian replied, the intention is complete observance of and absolute adherence to the commandments and admonitions of God. I repeat, complete observance of and absolute adherence to the commandments and admonitions of God. However daunting this may be, I think we are happy that there's always a possibility for us to reach this station. We advance higher into the spiritual plane every day when we observe His laws and strive to live the Baha'i life. In doing this, we remain faithful to His covenant. I personally feel that a strong indication of this faithfulness will be our alacrity to respond to the plans of the Universal House of Justice. For the current global plan, His guidance has been clearly expounded in His letter of 27 December 2005 to the Councilors Conference. So my dear friends, in a nutshell, my parting words run in this vein. We have accepted the revelation of Baha'u'llah. It is our heart's desire to approach Him, and we have been provided the guidance that we need to fulfill our desire. And in this plan, and we will receive further guidance as we go from one plan to another. We only need to nurture His love in our hearts, observe His commandments and admonitions, and on the wings of detachment, soar up into the plane of sacrifice for this current plan and beyond. Many thanks for patiently bearing with me during this presentation. Have a good night.
Thank you, Mrs. Ramirez. I know I speak for all of us from the bottom of our hearts that you've given us a great deal to think about, contemplate on, and hopefully put into action. Just a few words about tomorrow's workshops. For those participating in the workshops, in the morning we have 3 sessions of Life of Service. We have Life of Service A, the Spiritual Dimensions of Work, conducted by Mr. Stephen Hall in the multi-purpose room of the International Teaching Center. Life of Service B will also be held at that time. It's called Coherence Between Work and Service by Mr. Paul Lampel in the auditorium. The third Life of Service C, The Unfoldment of the Divine Plan by Mr. Hartmut Grossman, is at the far end of the dining room. To complement these workshops, after our second break in the later part of the morning, there'll be a series of sessions on the progress of the faith that describes the circumstances in the diverse continents that will be conducted by the members of the International Teaching Center. Those participating in the review of Africa will meet in the multi-purpose room of the International Teaching Center building. Those attending the Americas will meet here in the auditorium. The participants attending the ones for Asia will join their friends in the far end of the dining room. Australasia will be held in Conference Room 6 on level 6 of the International Teaching Center building. And last but not least, those attending the continent for Europe will be held in Conference Room 4B, which is the private dining room on level 4. Any of the participants wishing to understand and review their individual schedules can check on the info web under Serving the Divine Plan, and they will just reconfirm the sessions they've been signed up for. Also tomorrow when you arrive at 8:30, a little bit before, you'll actually see everything posted just outside the dining room and then on the separate locations as well. In closing, I wanted to remind everybody that next month's program, the talk will be held on Friday night, October the 27th, and the workshops will be held on Saturday, October the 28th. The talk on Friday evening is by Dr. Feridun Javahari, and he will speak to us on opposition and perseverance. After our closing prayer this evening, the members of the logistical committee would like to invite everybody to join us in the dining room for